Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Managers are everywhere. Everywhere we enter and use the services or products of organizations, there are managers, multiples of managers. So within the big P of our investigation and practice, there are so many types of managers, or as we call them in this conversation, managerial leaders, that there's something to be learned whether we are actually practicing management or practicing managers or not. They have a lot of impact on our daily lives. So I hope you will glean a lot of useful information in this conversation.
Well, Peter, we've had a number of, I hope, very interesting conversations for the benefit of those who listen. And in some ways, perhaps in every one of our conversations, we allude to our background as management educators, keyword management. And yet we haven't devoted too much attention per se to that kind of practice, the managerial practice. And my thought is that no one who's listening to this can turn very far in their life without looking at a managed organization, meaning they're persons who practice management on behalf of the rest to keep the organization flowing forward, or however we want to talk about it. But that practice is so pervasive that it seems like it would be useful to share some thoughts about it. In particular, you wrote a book not too many years ago called Managing as a Performing Art. And that title caught a lot of people's imaginations. They went, what? Management is a science.
Yes.
So let's think out loud about the practice of management, perhaps then and now, since then was around the late 80s. And here we are 40 years later. And organizations still claim to be managed, so someone's doing the job.
Yeah. Well, it's a very elusive subject, a fascinating one from my point of view. And I remember when I was interviewing at George Washington to be their dean, and they asked me why I wanted to be a dean of a school like George Washington. And my answer was because it's a business school and a school of healthcare administration and a school of urban planning and a school of accountancy. Let's see, was there one other? A school of public administration. They were all under one roof. Yeah. All these different fields under one roof: urban planning and public administration and accounting and business. And under business, we had 11 different sub-departments of business: marketing and finance, and on and on. And I was thrilled by that structure, even though you could also be intimidated by it or horrified by it or disgusted by it on the grounds it was just too sloppy to be believed. And those people obviously don't know what they're doing if they put all those different departments under one roof. And I was thrilled by it. And for the first couple of years that I was dean, I constantly talked about in my mind, the threads that held all those together and gave them some reason to be under the same roof. And it was around the same time I wrote an essay called Management as a Liberal Art. And the principal thesis of that essay was that in order to manage anything, you have to be conversant with its essence. And it's almost impossible to have a pure something to management, even though you might think that the school of accountancy was pretty pure and not really broad-gauged at all. Nevertheless, an accountant gets involved with a wide range of clients and needs to be conversant with their essence. And so if you're going to have a school of accounting, you need to help those students begin to understand what the essence of organizations is. You can be cynical and say the essence is grubbing money, but I choose not to pick it up that way. So I've always found it a very exciting and challenging subject, even though it has such loose boundaries. However, in recent years, I've had to change my focus a little bit because, as you know, and I've talked in these podcasts about this concept I call permanent whitewater, by which I mean nonstop chaotic change, in which virtually all managers these days are dealing with lots of bizarre things that they never thought they would have to be involved in. And those bizarre things are hitting them from all sides with a certain amount of urgency, often with extreme urgency. And like that earthquake that hit the World Series here a few years ago and caved in all the highways in San Francisco. That's what you might call extreme urgency. And in fact, Marriott was opening its flagship hotel in San Francisco that afternoon, 5:00 that afternoon. And of course, the earthquake disrupted everything. But they were very proud to tell you that they were up and running again within 24 hours. People asked them, how in the world did you do that? And the answer was, we dropped all distinctions of rank and authority. And we just created a series of emergent teams that took on various pieces of the problem. And we worked together like a bunch of really serious, dedicated people. And that's that kind of spontaneous leadership paradigm case. But what I've had to change my thinking to is the fact that all this nonstop chaotic change that in fact some people say it is indeed accelerating. Just when you think things can't get any crazier, they get crazier. Somebody goes into a grade school with AR-15 and opens up on third graders. Well, that problem is on somebody's desk. It's on several people's desks. And they don't have the luxury of just sitting in and contemplating the horror of such an event. They've got a school to run. They have parents whose grief to address. They have budget overruns. They have questions of when do we reopen after this cataclysmic event? Do we reopen? Do we just cancel the year? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of questions are the kinds of things that are coming across all managers' desks all the time. I like to say, I may have used the example in an earlier podcast. I like to say that one of the more, I guess, amusing, but not amusing to the people it happened to. I was sitting in the office of the executive vice president of Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, and his phone rang. He's one of these executives who, when he's in the office, he likes to pick up his own phone and answer and get on a first name basis with whoever he's talking to. And on the other end was somebody from one of the units out in the hospital somewhere in a panic because they had a new chaplain, happened to be a Protestant chaplain. And this Protestant chaplain was going up and down the hall of the unit, pulling people out of bed and getting them on their knees, having a come to Jesus moment. And what are we going to do about this? Well, in a supreme act of delegation, which I've never forgotten, he said, Well, who's the chaplain in charge this month? The rabbi? Let the rabbi handle it, and hung up.
What an image.
But if you can picture a very dedicated clergyman who is convinced that Jesus will take up their beds and let them walk if they simply have enough faith, practicing his faith, practicing his faith by, I think, pulling people out of bed is a little bit too exaggerated an image, but let's say helping people out of bed, encouraging people out of bed. But in any event, it was still a shock to the others on the unit. So in light of these problems, or of these kinds of trends, nonstop change, let me add one more thought that you don't hear very often, and that is that all leadership is concerned with change. That's what leaders do, is that they propose changes. And if they do it well, and if the changes are well-founded, they might be regarded as a great leader. But they can also do it very clumsily. They can do it in a manipulative way, or try to do it in a manipulative way. There's all kinds of ways that you can screw up as a leader, as we know. But in any event, leadership is change. And the two words are interchangeable in an organizational context. And that's little syllogism says to me, therefore, managers are leaders because they're dealing with so much change, whether they've chosen it or not. A lot of it they have chosen, but a lot of it they haven't. And in any event, they have to somehow incorporate it into the life of the organization that they're the manager of. Now, I'm not expecting that anytime soon all jobs that are labeled management will be relabeled leadership. But I will say that we need to understand that if you're choosing a manager for a new position, you're choosing somebody who is going to need to be an effective leader. That's the principal thing that individual is going to need to know how to do, is lead. And not lead money, and not lead equipment, and not lead markets, and not lead abstractions. Lead concrete, flesh and blood people, individuals with their own agendas, their own feelings, their own hopes and fears, loyalties and disloyalties. And to me, that begins to move toward a quite different way of thinking about what management is. And all of these structural prescription about managers who they have X amount of authority, and they have this span of control, and they have all of these kind of bureaucratic names for the range of responsibilities that they have, all need to be reconsidered, because all of those things are under, what would you say?
Assault.
The winds of change.
Yeah, assault.
Assault, yes.
And they're particularly under scrutiny. Perhaps one of the biggest things has changed in 40 years, Peter, is how many ways people can peek into what's going on in any kind of organization and then start talking about it.
Yes.
On social media. I just saw in today's news update, that the CEO of organizations stepped down. Now, I'll have to edit this because I can't remember the point of who it was, but the point I'm making, I know.
Yeah.
McDonald's.
Oh.
CEO of McDonald's. And he had been brought on just 2 years ago to modernize McDonald's. So he's putting in ordering kiosks, which eliminates the number of people you have to have behind the counter, and some other things that he was doing. But according to the story, he got involved in a an affair with one of his employees. Now, that could have gone on for centuries and probably did. But now, as successful as you may appear to be in managing, you've also got to be moral and ethical to the extent that you don't get caught doing such things and lose a $8-9 million job.
Well, that's right.
So
all leaders are moral agents.
Yes. And when that gets forgotten, they pay these days, they'll pay quite a large price, to be found out. And yet they still do it.
Yes, they do.
Yes, they do. I was listening to your talking about management and then leadership, and I always get this feeling of, the old idea of titration. When I was in a science class, they would have this strip, and you'd be putting just droplets of a particular chemical into a beaker, and you'd have the strip in there, and the strip would be red, and then it would suddenly turn blue when that last drop of that from your eyedropper went in. The titration would suddenly turn a different color. And to the point of management as we used to think about it and teach it, to now, the titration is more leadership, less of the other things that managers do, more leadership. And that opens the question of the practice of management and the practice of leadership. Are they one and the same? This is a classic debate, and if so, then managers must be managerial leaders, or leaders who also manage. What is your thinking on that?
Well, I have encountered the same kind of question of that duality of management and managing and leading, as somewhere back in one of our earlier podcasts, I seem to remember I made a speech about how we should be talking about managing and leading, not management and leadership.
That's right.
Because the management and leadership are such static concepts, and managing and leading are such dynamic processes. And I think I threw in probably a couple of wisecracks about would we talk about nursement? Would we talk about sailment or golfment? I don't say I'm a golfer. I say I'm engaged in golfment. Doesn't that sound a little bizarre? A little bizarre.
Yeah.
So I have come to the conclusion that I need a concept I'm going to call managerial leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And managerial leadership simply means that the core behavior is what we mean by leading human beings. But the context is what has traditionally been known as the management context or the managerial context. That is to say, an organization, a bounded organization. So we're not talking about the kind of leadership that a presidential candidate necessarily manifests, although we would hope that he or she had some understanding of the bureaucracy that is the federal government, and could formulate their policies in relation to the needs of that bureaucracy and the limits of that bureaucracy. So managerial leadership is what I find myself talking about increasingly these days, and it's the practice of managerial leadership that I would like to have as my principal focus. Then we get down to the more nitty-gritty level of, so what are we talking about when we say a bounded organization? A bounded organization, what does that mean? Well, it does mean what has traditionally been called a span of control. it probably has some meaning of physical limits or physical dimensions of the unit that the manager is a managerial leader of, some statement of responsibilities, some statement certainly of mission and objectives. And to spell all that out, which has traditionally been the responsibility of the human resources people after so-called line management or upper line management has set the general boundaries and said that some person, man or woman, is going to be in charge of marketing. We're going to be in charge of finance. Having said that, then you've got to become more detailed and focused in what exactly you mean by being in charge of finance. And so you go on, and you finally come down to some focus that you're going to call this person's principal function. And what you have to keep reminding yourself of is that the core behavior is leading. And so you're going to have some statement in there about the responsibilities the individual has toward helping the people within his or her span of control to understand and adapt to change and to function in relation to it. So, without giving a long lecture on the nature of management, I would rewrite an awful lot of textbooks that go on and on for chapter after chapter after chapter, emphasizing what managers do or what management is, without ever hinting that the context is going to be a very dynamic one with a lot of change.
That's right.
Back in 1991, just to crystallize my own thinking about this problem, I wrote the following little paragraph: the messiness, contingency, sprawl, and indeed danger of the real managerial world ought to be the centerpiece of our thinking, not a footnote or an afterthought, not a concession to learner questions about relevancy, not something we find merely amusing or annoying because it doesn't fit in with the neat prescriptions we'd like to make to leaders and managers. Centerpiece of our thinking. The messiness, contingency, sprawl, and indeed danger of the real managerial world ought to be the centerpiece of our thinking. And I'm afraid for too many of us academics, in order to have a nice, neat field to theorize about, we have banished a lot of the messiness, contingency, and sprawl, and indeed danger of the real managerial world. I wonder how many management textbooks these days are being written with a chapter, or at least a substantial section, on terrorism and on adapting to a climate that is vulnerable to these individuals with their AR-15s and their impulses to shake things up a little bit.
Yeah, who was managing the Walmart store in Texas the Sunday that someone came in and killed over 100 people? Those things in textbooks, no. And since I was working with them right up through 2016, and they'd have one chapter on leadership, and it would be largely somewhat of a cliff note on the prominent leadership theories, very few which changed in the 2000s from what I could see, and they were still quoting Fred Fiedler in the leadership model that you had me do my dissertation about some years after, somewhat debunked, much to Fred Fiedler's anger. But it's cordoned off. Leadership in those texts is cordoned off. somewhat. But here's our responsibility in these podcasts. When people put their lives down in the day in a practice called managerial leadership, most of that day, from when I'm inferring, their responsibility is to be looking ahead, looking out, and even looking inward to see where the changes are coming or have already hit. Now, a whole lot of their rest of their attention could be mechanized, could be turned into artificial intelligence solutions. Many of the mechanical functions that we used to teach of managing, budgeting, all of that can be done with a couple of clicks of a mouse now. So that frees them up if they have this intention to be that kind of vanguard for their part of the organization for which they're responsible. But I don't hear that. I try to stay in touch with the conversations in the academy and everything else. I really don't hear people talking this way, writing this way.
No.
What's going on here, Peter? You wrote that in 1991, and a lot of people read your stuff back then. What's the resistance? It seems like it's a responsibility of ours to be sure we're not sending people out with degrees and certificates to say they can manage when we haven't helped them become more leaderly before they do.
Yes. Well, and I would also add that I think this point applies to the curricular content of almost all professional schools.
Yeah, you're right.
Not just ones that say they're concerned with management.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that, again, a point that is not made as often as it should be made. No matter what professional school you're in, you're going to be blending technical knowledge with your knowledge of people and how they work together or don't, and how change occurs or doesn't within the field that the profession is concerned with. And yet, I'm not sure that students hear as much about the human problems of that profession as they need to hear, that they hear primarily the technical content. I know many of the physicians that I talk to and see, and I'm seeing a lot of them these days, will all agree that they'll say things like, well, I didn't get enough in medical school on this bedside manner that everybody talks about. And you and I have both had the experience, I'm sure, of students who come back to our business schools and say, I wish I had taken more human behavior courses and not just so many courses in accounting or so many courses in finance.
I heard that again and again. And I also hear that accounting has changed so much now that whatever they were taught even 10 years ago is pretty much by the boards, and as well as with finance. It was good to have been exposed to it back then, but what they do tell me is how their day goes, which is largely, in quotes, interrupted by change.
Yes. Yes.
Interrupted. And we're saying, hey, if it's not being interrupted, you're not managing and leading. I mean, you haven't put the two together. If you're leading, you would be seeking interruption. And if you're managing, you'd be trying to deal with it in a responsible and timely manner. Yeah, there's no doubt that all of those things happen. And as a quick point on that, I heard a little blurb from a friend of ours who was fined $95 for being 5 minutes late for a medical appointment, for which she spends over $200. And guess how long the appointment is? 10 minutes.
Yes.
10 minutes. This woman, who's in her 60s, did call in on a Friday to say I couldn't be there quite on time on Monday, but they didn't get the message. They fined her $95, and they said, we'll have to ask the doctor for permission to waive this particular penalty. Now, just the feeling of that, you're in your 60s, and there are things happening to your body that you can't quite understand. First, at best, you're going to get 10 minutes of attention, 8 minutes of which the guy's going to be typing, or the woman's going to be typing in their electronic records, which have a lot to do with preventing suits later on. See, I typed it, so I did tell you, don't take this, take that. So I use it. I thought it was an exaggeration when I got this understand this explanation. I thought no, but then even in my own experience, they're shortening now the amount of time you'll spend with a primary physician. The one who I had, who really helped diagnose what has now kept me alive, an early onset cancer, he retired in disgust a few months ago because he said, I can't spend the time being a doctor. Now, there's a managerial aspect to that. The construction of an organization which allocates 15 minutes or less for critical care, critical attention to emerging symptoms is justified, I guess there is the word, as because the economics now are such that we need to push that many patients through in a day in order to pay for this practice that this doctor is being supported by. Anyway, there's a lot of necessary attention that needs to be paid to the managerial practice, managerial leadership practice, which is what we started this discussion on. To the extent that if we think of all the elements or the conjectures that we've done about practice, how well do they match up with the managing practice itself, which many thousands of people aspire to, and choose to do?
Quite a few, I think, is the answer.
Mm-hmm. It should be all of them, but I'm wondering if there's some things about the impossibility of dealing with all this change in the white waters of managing that make many of the elements of practice that we've thought about, particularly the more poetic ones, the more personal, deep inside out kinds of connections to the practice. We want them to get better at practicing managerial leadership. Of course we do. But this may be the toughest one that I can think of among the various ways that people practice within our big P.
Well, I'm just scanning down the list of conjectures that we've been working off, and we've been talking so much about learning. Practice is continual learning. Well, that is certainly true in these positions of managerial leadership that we're talking about, because every one of these changes that we're talking about that occur requires that a new user manual be read and understood, or that a briefing be gone to, so that you can come back to your own people and explain this, that, or the other thing. This some new policy that is being adopted for the organization as a whole or something. And we've said that this kind of learning is so pervasive and so constant in the need for it, in its presence, that it might as well be regarded as a practice itself. You're not just learning on the side or learning on the fly. Your learning needs to be regarded as a practice itself. We've talked a lot about how so much of the context that managers operate in are matters of perception, and who sees things one way and who sees things another way.
Right.
And that, in a very real sense, what the manager is managing is the interaction of these various points of view that are present around any organizational situation. And if the manager doesn't realize that he or she is doing that, and instead simply has their own point of view, which they attempt to sell to or enforce on the perceptions of all the others, that individual is going to get into difficulty right away. you are of course have a point of view of your own, and it of course deserves to have considerable influence in the outcome of any decision situation. But if you don't realize that the other points of view that are operating in the situation have their own validity and their own rights to be heard, you're going to be in trouble right away.
That's right.
And you're going to have people going to be saying things like, well, Peter just doesn't get it. and my manager just doesn't get it, doesn't understand me, doesn't care about me, and so forth. And so to think of yourself as managing a system of perceptions which are interacting to whatever degree with each other, and that out of that interaction is somehow going to come, hopefully, a way of thinking or a point of view that most people can live with,
which keeps you going forward.
That's what you're aiming for, is an outcome that most people can live with, and that makes sense for the organization.
And living with it has a lot of different nuances. But
yes.
I always feel that we're putting our lives into organization, day to day when we become employed. And, the quality of our life is heavily determined by what people agree to live with within an organization. And then, as you mentioned earlier, there are moments when lives are at stake, literally at stake, and you have to deal with that. But I think those two that you brought up, those two conjectures, that learning should be a practice unto itself and how important perception is, put those two together, and I think we could very much change the way we're preparing people for managerial leadership, because we need to have them understand that the practice of learning cannot be disengaged at all from the practice of managing. That it's leading, learning, and managing. Sounds like a book I read by Peter Vaill. But here it is, and it's more clear to me now than ever that the learning determines what's perceived and what you hear others and incorporate into their perceptions. So there's a tremendous connection there. And it means that you want to have employed, or you're going to be leading people who also will be keen learners in the ideal sense of the word. And so I think we've done a lot with this conversation, but my clock is telling me we've got to spare our listeners for another day of listening to us, thinking about, caring about practice. Final thoughts, Peter?
Well, let's see. I always liked the image of a performing art because it captures the dynamism and the artistic process of self-expression, which is what you're doing when you're managing and leading a group of people. One dimension of the of practice in general that spent maybe as much time on as we could or should is our conjecture was that the practice is a temporal process.
Mm-hmm.
And what we meant by that was that it's something that goes on and on. It isn't just a snapshot. Practice behavior of the practitioner is not just snapshots, but a temporal process that lasts over a period of time. And the acts flow into each other, and they have downstream consequences and so forth. And I remember as a student reading cases at the Harvard Business School, it used to disturb me a little bit that so many of the cases were just snapshots.
That's right.
With very little reference to the downstream consequences or to the temporal dimensions. Sometimes they would have a case that they had a series of cases they called the Marshall Company.
I remember those.
And it spanned, I think, 2 or 3 years, or maybe even more than that, in the life of a paper company and the leadership that was needed in this paper company. But there was not nearly enough of that. I think that the temporal or the time implications of actions that you're considering taking are much more on managerial leaders' minds than our present ways of talking about management and leadership allow for.
I agree.
So I'll throw that into the mix. But I'll come back to simply reiterate my own fascination with this subject and what does go on and could go on within the four walls of some place that calls itself a school of management.